Genevieve St. Clair, a wealthy socialite who lived for luxury and perfection, boarded a flight expecting nothing but comfort. But when a crisis struck midair, her survival depended on the very person she dismissed, a humble mechanic. This story isn't just about what happened. It's about the unexpected lessons life teaches us when we least expect them. Stick around because what unfolds next will leave you rethinking everything. And before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories like this one. Also, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Genevieve sat in the exclusive first-class lounge, her presence commanding attention without a word. The sleek marble floors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, and attendants moved swiftly, offering freshly brewed espresso and chilled champagne. Genevieve barely acknowledged them. She was absorbed in her phone, scrolling through messages from designers confirming her upcoming fittings. Beside her was a custom leather handbag worth more than some people's annual salary. Her luggage, a set of limited edition designer trunks, stood neat and stacked, a silent yet bold declaration of her status. To Genevieve, this was life as it should be, opulent, seamless, and tailored to her every need. She glanced around the lounge, noting the impeccably dressed clientele. They were her kind of people, each as polished and curated as the room itself. She relished the unspoken hierarchy here, a world where appearances and prestige were everything. But not far from this bubble of elegance, at the general boarding gate, sat Thomas Grant. He was hunched over a battered duffel bag, quietly flipping through a book with frayed pages. His clothes were simple, a plaid shirt and jeans that had clearly seen better days. His boots bore the scuffs of a long work week, and his hands, strong, calloused, and stained with oil, were a testament to years of labor. Thomas wasn't here for luxury or status. This was just another journey, a chance to relax before returning to the grind. While others in the gate area chatted or scrolled through their phones, Thomas simply observed. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He existed in stark contrast to the world Genevieve lived in, a world that would likely overlook someone like him without a second thought. When the announcement for boarding was made, Genevieve rose gracefully, her heels clicking against the marble as she headed toward the private boarding entrance reserved for first-class passengers. She handed her ticket to the attendant, barely sparing a glance. This process was automatic, predictable. She expected nothing less than perfection. But as she entered the plane and settled into her plush seat, her composure faltered. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something. Someone. It was Thomas. He stepped onto the plane with quiet confidence, his ticket clutched in his hand. He wasn't looking around in awe or fumbling with his belongings like she imagined he might. He simply walked forward, scanning the seat numbers until he stopped right beside her. Genevieve's heart sank. Her eyes darted to the empty seat next to her, then back to him. Surely this couldn't be right. How could someone like him end up here in first class? Her grip tightened on her designer clutch as a wave of irritation washed over her. Thomas gave her a polite nod before placing his bag in the overhead compartment. He didn't seem to notice, or perhaps didn't care, about the daggers Genevieve's eyes were throwing his way. But Genevieve couldn't ignore him. The scent of motor oil seemed to linger faintly around him, clashing with the delicate floral perfume she had sprayed that morning. She leaned toward the flight attendant, her voice low and clipped. "There must be some mistake," she said, her tone sharp enough to slice through the air. The attendant checked the manifest and assured her everything was correct. The man seated beside her was indeed meant to be there. Genevieve turned back to her seat, her annoyance bubbling beneath the surface. This wasn't how her flight was supposed to go. She wanted calm sophistication, refinement. Instead, she was now stuck next to someone who didn't belong. But what Genevieve didn't know, what no one on that plane could have predicted, was that Thomas's presence wasn't a mistake. It was destiny. Their paths had crossed for a reason, and by the time the plane landed, her carefully constructed world would never be the same. If you're finding this story as captivating as we are, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It's a small action, but it helps us bring you more powerful and thought-provoking stories like this one. Your support means everything, and we truly appreciate it. Sometimes the people we least expect have the greatest impact on our lives. This is just the beginning of an extraordinary journey. Genevieve sat stiffly in her seat, her back perfectly straight, arms crossed over her lap. The soft hum of the engines did little to calm her rising irritation. She wasn't used to this, being uncomfortable in her world. Everything was curated to her liking, from the texture of her room to the texture of her sheets. But now her luxurious cocoon was being invaded by a man who, in her mind, had no place here. Genevieve's gaze flicked toward Thomas as he quietly adjusted his seatbelt. His demeanor was composed, almost serene. But to Genevieve, his very presence was an affront. She pressed the flight attendant button, her manicured finger tapping impatiently against the armrest. When the attendant arrived, she wasted no time. "Is there another seat available? I'd prefer not to sit here," she said, her voice dripping with disapproval. The attendant, ever professional, smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is fully booked. All seats in first class are occupied." Genevieve's lips tightened into a thin line. She was unaccustomed to hearing the word no. With a curt nod, she dismissed the attendant and sank back into her seat. Though her frustration was evident in every movement, meanwhile, Thomas sat quietly, pretending not to notice the exchange. But he noticed everything. The sideways glances, the slight wrinkle of her nose, the way she angled her body away from him, as if his proximity might contaminate her. He was no stranger to judgment. People often made assumptions about him based on his appearance, his boots, his hands, his clothes. They told a story most people didn't care to read. What they didn't see was the man behind the grease-stained hands. Thomas was more than a mechanic. He had built his own business from the ground up, starting with nothing but a toolbox and a dream. Late nights and early mornings had defined his life, but it wasn't just work that drove him. He had a family, a wife who believed in him, and 2 kids who looked up to him like he was their hero. As the plane taxied down the runway, Genevieve let out a soft, audible sigh. Her annoyance simmered just below the surface. "I suppose you don't fly often," she said, her tone clipped, as she glanced sideways at Thomas. Thomas turned to her, his expression calm and polite, with just a hint of humor, as if her comment didn't bother him in the slightest. "Not often in first class, no," he replied. Genevieve raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint, disbelieving smile. "I figured as much," she said, turning her gaze back to the window. Thomas didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a book, an old, dog-eared paperback. He flipped it open to a marked page and began to read, seemingly unfazed by her dismissive attitude. Genevieve couldn't help but glance at the book out of the corner of her eye. The cover was worn, the title faded, but she could make out the words leadership and character. She frowned slightly, puzzled. It wasn't what she expected someone like him to be reading. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Genevieve tried to immerse herself in her own activities, scrolling through her phone, flipping through a glossy magazine, but her irritation remained. At one point, Thomas shifted slightly, bumping her armrest by accident. "Do you mind?" she snapped, her voice low but sharp. Thomas looked up, meeting her gaze with a calm, apologetic smile. "Sorry about that," he said, adjusting his position to give her more space. Genevieve huffed, her patience wearing thin. Yet no matter how cold or dismissive she was, Thomas remained composed. He was as if nothing she said could rattle him. As the flight attendants began their service, Genevieve leaned forward to request a glass of wine. She noticed Thomas declining the offered drink, asking instead for a glass of water. His polite tone and simple request stood in stark contrast to her own demands for perfection. "No wine for you?" she asked, her curiosity slipping through despite herself. "Not today," he replied, glancing at her with a slight smile. "I've got an early morning tomorrow. I need to stay sharp." Genevieve raised an eyebrow, momentarily caught off guard. She wanted to ask what he meant, but stopped herself. After all, what could someone like him possibly have to stay sharp for? And yet, as the flight continued, she found herself stealing glances at him. There was something about his quiet confidence that gnawed at her. He didn't seem intimidated by her or the world she represented. Instead, he seemed content. It was a quality she hadn't felt in a long time. Though she would never admit it, Genevieve had everything she thought she needed: wealth, beauty, and influence. But beneath the surface, there was a void she couldn't fill. Her days were a blur of meetings and events, her nights spent alone in a sprawling penthouse. She had mastered the art of appearing untouchable, yet the truth was she often felt isolated, disconnected. As she sat there, her annoyance began to shift. It wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about the quiet truth he represented. The idea that happiness and worth weren't tied to money or status. It was a truth she wasn't ready to face, but one she couldn't ignore. The tension between them lingered, two worlds colliding in a single row of seats. Neither of them knew it yet, but this flight would challenge everything they thought they knew about life, success, and the value of a person. The stage was set. The walls Genevieve had built around herself were beginning to crack, and Thomas, without even trying, was holding up a mirror to her carefully curated life. As the plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, the calm was shattered by a sudden, jarring turbulence. Gasps echoed through the cabin as the plane dipped slightly, the fastened seatbelt sign illuminating with a sharp ding. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a technical issue. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened as we work to address the situation." Genevieve clutched the armrests, her manicured fingers digging into the leather. She glanced around nervously, her usual composure slipping. Meanwhile, Thomas sat still, his expression calm but focused. His eyes scanned the cabin, his instincts already kicking in. Minutes passed, each one heavier than the last. The turbulence worsened, and the plane jolted violently, causing drinks and belongings to tumble onto the floor. A faint smell of smoke began to waft through the cabin, and whispers of panic spread like wildfire. Then came the announcement that sent a chill through everyone on board. "This is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a critical issue with one of our engines. We're preparing for an emergency landing." The fear was unmistakable. Passengers began to cry, whisper prayers, and hold tightly to one another. Genevieve's heart raced as she gripped her seatbelt, her mind spiraling into worst-case scenarios. And then, just as the flight attendants began to instruct passengers on emergency procedures, Thomas stood up. "Sit down, sir," one of the attendants said sharply, her voice trembling. Thomas raised his hands, his tone calm but authoritative. "I'm a mechanic. If there is an issue with the engine, I might be able to help." For a moment, the cabin fell silent. The attendant hesitated, then glanced at the lead flight attendant, who nodded. Without wasting another second, Thomas was escorted toward the cockpit. Genevieve watched in stunned silence as he disappeared behind the door. Her earlier judgments about him suddenly felt so trivial, so foolish. Inside the cockpit, Thomas assessed the situation. The engine had overheated, a mechanical failure threatening to compromise the plane's stability. He worked alongside the pilots, his hands moving with the precision and expertise honed through years of experience. "We need to stabilize the airflow to the remaining engines," he instructed, his voice steady despite the chaos. "This can buy us enough time to land safely." The pilots followed his advice, and Thomas manually adjusted a set of controls. It was a risky move, but it was their best chance. As the plane began its emergency descent, Thomas monitored the systems, ensuring his temporary fix held. Back in the cabin, Genevieve sat frozen, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. This man, the one she had dismissed so easily, was now the reason she might survive. She thought of her life, her wealth, her influence. None of it mattered now, none of it could save her. The only thing standing between her and disaster was the unassuming man she had judged so harshly. The plane touched down on an emergency runway with a bone-jarring thud. The cabin erupted into cheers and cries of relief as the plane slowed to a stop. Smoke poured faintly from one of the engines, but they were safe. Everyone on board had survived. As the passengers began to disembark, the captain stepped into the cabin and addressed them. "I'd like to thank our flight crew and especially Mr. Thomas Grant, whose quick thinking and expertise were instrumental in ensuring a safe landing. We owe him a debt of gratitude." The cabin filled with applause. Passengers clapped and cheered as Thomas emerged from the cockpit, his face calm, almost embarrassed by the attention. But his eyes reflected the weight of what had just happened. Genevieve's applause was slower, quieter. But her mind was racing. For the first time in her life, she felt something crack within her, a wall she had built between herself and the world. As she exited the plane, Genevieve hesitated at the gate. She turned back to see Thomas speaking with one of the crew members, his posture relaxed despite the ordeal. Gathering her courage, she approached him. I don't know what to say," she began, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "You saved all of us. You saved me. Thank you." Thomas looked at her, his expression kind but modest. "Just did my job," he said simply, as if saving lives were part of his everyday routine. But to Genevieve, it was more than that. It was a wake-up call. She had spent her entire life valuing the wrong things: wealth, appearances, status. And here was a man with none of those things, yet he had proven to be more capable, more selfless, and more heroic than anyone she had ever known. As she walked away, Genevieve couldn't help but glance back at him one last time. She felt something unfamiliar stir within her. Respect, gratitude, and perhaps a spark of something even deeper. For the first time, she realized that true worth wasn't about what you had. It was about who you were and what you gave to the world. And in that moment, Genevieve knew her life would never be the same again. Some moments define us and some people change us. For Genevieve, this flight wasn't just a journey. It was a second chance to rewrite her story. As the passengers disembarked, still buzzing with relief and gratitude, Genevieve lingered near the gate. She glanced back at Thomas one last time, her thoughts swirling with everything she just experienced. This wasn't just a flight. It was a wake-up call, a moment that had changed her forever. Some people walk into our lives for a reason, and Thomas Grant, a humble mechanic with the heart of a hero, had proven that true worth isn't about status or wealth. It's about courage, humility, and the willingness to help others when it matters most. Now imagine yourself in Genevieve's shoes. What would you have done? How would you have reacted if the very person you judged turned out to be your savior? If this story moved you, taught you something, or simply gave you hope, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that heroes come in all shapes and forms.